driven management took effect through the use of locally based Excel databases and systems, which means that the localization means also that farmers and local agents control the information and control the vision and the agenda right up to the evidence and the monitoring of the results. And that made it also a group effect where everyone was concerned by the scaling results and were actually monitoring it on a recurrent meeting and collaboration. And that fits with a whole series of these various elements in terms of actors, collaboration, and everything else. The adaptation was locally driven and was led actually by the users themselves. And so in the end, the irony is that we did not scale Nerica. We ended up scaling a whole portfolio of different varieties that the farmers actually found to be more, not more, but were productive, adapted, and fitted with their production systems and generated the same stable yield. However, the principle of a pure variety of controlled multiplication and of adapting to that variety a series of production practices, that concept scaled and really expanded and developed a positive spiral over time through these various iterations. What was interesting is that the program debriefs were led by the producers and firms, and the government and research were present, but in attendance, which means that the presentation and the technical delivery and the results were fully owned by the actors and discussed with them, with their potential technology partners. So all these notions of inclusion and localization, really making sure that the ownership of the scaling process and the development of the consequences that are implicit in the scaling process and the system changes that are needed was like totally pushed at the local level and led and created an impetus for change and adaptation and really generated a lot of champions. So you will recognize all these elements, but the way they were carried out was just to take the major step of going local, and you end up with surprises. Like I said, Nerica led to this man here, Mr. Ndiaye, who is inspecting an automated rain gauge calculator, a capture element that actually drove the development of indexed insurance in Senegal, which right now is actually a profit-generating activity for the insurance company, with some support from government, but actually covers his Nerica, or in this case, rain-fed rice production with a complement of maize, and protects it against rainfall shortages. And he's the one in charge of ensuring the maintenance of that rain gauge that covers a radius of 5 kilometers around the rain gauge and covers the various farms around him. Whole story around that, but it's strange. This is actually connected with the scale those seeds. To scale those seeds, we needed ag insurance to stabilize finance, to make sure that higher value seeds were accessible and made sense for a farmer like Mr. Ndiaye. So localization makes everyone uncomfortable, the same way that scaling made everyone uncomfortable in the early days, and still does, in the early days of Feed the Future. I remember when they told us, I remember meeting Trenchard, for those who know him, in Senegal in 2011. He met the project team and said, your rice program is great. What's your scaling objective? And he said, what do you mean? He said, well, I mean, in the end said, well, we're going to develop, a few pilots for work. We're going to cover 3% of the population and we'll have a trickle down effect. And he said, well, you're going to have to change your approach because we're really looking to something like more 60% of the population. And we have to find something to do about that. So localization is scary, and it usually comes with ambitious scaling objectives. And I think that's a way to push it. You want to have that uncomfortable discussion. And as an implementer, well, you got to deal with it. And you got to deal with it because you got to fix your contract. And so you have to come up with creative solutions to go local and make it work. And that means the very difficult decision of ceding control. And I mean, we try to create inclusion and inclusive discussions and participative work. But if you really want to get things going, you got to cede control. And you have to find a way of doing it on the basis of shared principles and making sure that that is backed by data-driven accountability. But all of these elements actually contribute to the actual smart rollout of the technology and the fact that everyone has to really understand what the drivers are if you are adopting that practice. But that there is that uncomfortable moment where people tell you, are you serious? Are you really going to contract with those farm groups? Are you really going to turn them into trainers and things like that? So, yeah, that's about it. And we're going to give them laptops in addition. So you have to scale through local organization. And here's a weird word. It's called multipolar and breeds resilient connectivity. And what does that mean? The fact is that if you create, rather than coming up with a single organization that organizes a region, what you saw in the previous maps is that you end up with 120 network anchors, and that's every anchor is a little pole of activity, and that connects with the environment in a different way. And that creates very complex connections and systems, but that are very, very resilient. And so that's an additional complexity of localization, is that you will not have a simple system. You're actually creating an entire ecosystem, which it has to be managed in a different way. One of the aspects, and we talk about it, is short value chains that comes with it. We can talk about that later, but it's the idea of starting small and then growing from there. Like in Senegal, we started on rice with local rice production, and right now it was able to evolve and grow into the Dakar market. And a lot of that growth was under the radar, so didn't face any countermeasures by the import lobby. Right now, the import lobby, saw the wave when it came and had to deal with it when it arrived. There's other concepts that are there. There's a different understanding. Going local means being in the farmer's shoes, so having a very different understanding of what the market is from their point of view. Site selling for a farmer does not exist. It's just I'm selling where it makes sense for me to sell, not necessarily.
So Michel, I'm going to ask you to wrap up, I think, within 2 minutes, so we have time for Jan's presentation.
I will. Okay.
Yeah.
I will do that. So just to complete, it's all pretty much in the same thread. The notion of localization is the fact of transferring control, leadership in the scaling to the actual actors and facilitating that process. Influence does it have? Well, going local means a very different types of activity sequencing, of activity division, of outcomes. Actually include systemic indicators, which means, are you developing connectivity? Are you developing diversification of networks? Finance and various performance grants are becoming more mainstream. That relationship between the donor and the actual type of approaches generate a lot of different.
Julie, are you still there?
I think we lost Jean-Michel.
I think we lost
Julie.
Jean-Michel, yes.
Maybe we also lost Julie. There she is.
Yeah. We lost Jean-Michel, however, and I don't see anybody else. Thanks.
I hear you. I hear you. I was muted.
He's back. Okay.
Ah, okay. Great. Okay, Jean-Michel, can you finish up, or are you done? I mean, I think we can address some of these interesting topics during the Q&A.
I finished. Just the last slide. The only point I was saying is that, you know, it doesn't mean that localization doesn't mean that government support will stop. It's just that government support will take the form of normal government investment in the sector, which means like roads or different types of infrastructure or government-led programs. But the activity itself, the scaling activity, will have disappeared.
Great. Okay, thank you. Thank you so much. So I think let's turn immediately to Jan to tell us about her experiences with localization and adaptation with sweet potato across sub-Saharan Africa. And Jan, you're going to share your screen, I know, and I apologize for the audio problems that we had during Jean-Michel's presentation. And if we have the same kind of audio problems with you, Jan, I'm going to stop you, and then I'll share my screen. But let's try it first with you sharing your screen and see. Hopefully, all will be well. So, Jan, take it away.
Okay, thank you, Julie, and very interesting, Jean-Michel. I learned a lot, and our story is going to be different than yours, and I think it reflects in part starting at a different point and working with a vegetatively propagated crop. And we're looking at the scaling of orange flesh sweet potato in sub-Saharan Africa. And just to give a little background on that perspective, the majority of varieties in sub-Saharan Africa traditionally have been white fleshed. And so the consideration was to move from a white flesh type to an orange flesh type because of the high vitamin A content of those varieties. So I would always say, why did it take us 25 years to get there? Because, you know, sweet potato cultivation is widely known, and clearly human health should be a priority. But it is the story of the innovation process. And if you look at the overall timeline of the 5 phases, which we've documented in an article in Agricultural Systems, it really does reinforce that principle number 7 in that scaling principles document of iterate, learn, adapt, and sustain. And the need, I think, for persistence. I want to acknowledge the 2 breeders and myself who were in this process for over 20 years, and how long it does take when you're introducing a new concept, which was integrated agriculture and nutrition, to get the evidence, the funding, to get the evidence base building out those partnerships, and really coming up with the evidence that it takes to get people, and following really along those lines of the principles of seeing is believing as the most effective way to stimulate uptake and change, but also facing the recognition that sometimes in terms of cost per beneficiary, that's a very costly way in which to do business as well. So we're always having to trade off the pressure to reach numbers against what it costs to do a really quality job of working on behavioral change, and really the changing in the concept of what the food system should be providing. So one of, I think, the innovative things we attempted to do, which really fits into the principle of, number one of setting a vision and a target and a goal and trying to bring partnerships together was the Sweet Potato Profit and Health Initiative, which we launched in 2009. And the initiative was the idea that we would work on getting the improved varieties and promoting diversified use out to a large number of households across 15 countries in a 10-year time frame, and try and get that scaling process moving while we were actually conducting significant research to address what we considered to be the bottlenecks for sweet potato reaching its full potential on the continent. And I think setting that vision was a great way to bring people together. And you can see at the bottom that meant bringing donors who believed in the concept together, but also a number of implementing partners as well as research partners together to engage under the same umbrella. And one of the key things, I think the lessons we learned in that process was that if you're going to bring people under an umbrella, and some of them are using their own resources to do what they're going to do under that umbrella, you can't be demanding a large amount of data from them. So we had very simple indicators that they, by being part of the initiative, would report to a centralized data collection strategy, which was basically the number of beneficiaries being reached, hopefully broken down by gender, is reached directly with the improved sweet potato varieties. Because everybody, you learn when you're working with diverse partners that everybody has their own system of data collection, and they don't want to be burdened with additional data collection. So unless you as an institution are providing them with the resources to do so, in these kind of umbrella initiatives to try and go to scale across countries, you have to keep the requirements fairly lean. That being said, because we had a concurrent research initiative, we remained really committed to the principle number 8 of continuing to learn and building the evidence base as we tested what we called delivery system models with a diversity of partners. Now, as we move in, and Julie, I think mentioned earlier, obviously, as you start to think about the scaling process more systematically, certainly within the emerging 1CGIR, which I think most people on this call know that many of the centers are joining under a more united administrative umbrella. And this is going to enable us to do more what we call agri-food systems approaches to our work. Scaling is really being mainstreamed as something that, particularly in what the so-called regional initiatives are, scaling is being mainstreamed as something we should be thinking of from the outset. And what is the model of scaling? And to be honest, I don't think the localization issue has been broadly discussed within that context. But is a consequence taking what they call, or what is being used as the scaling readiness framework. I think it's been a very interesting framework, and actually under the Roots, Tubers, and Bananas Consortium Research Program, we looked across the biofortified orange flesh sweet potato, the yellow cassava, the bananas, and it's still emergent, the biofortified iron enhanced potato. And just to see where they were in sort of this scaling readiness concept. And what is interesting here to me is that when we put together these innovation packages, which takes something like the core of the adapted orange flesh sweet potato varieties, and some other core activities that must be in place, and in particular for a vegetatively propagated crop, it is this network of basic and tertiary planting material trained multipliers who are at the local level, which are core, because seed companies in Africa just aren't interested in taking on a vegetatively propagated crop because it's so easy to share among farmers. So really having to develop and test and expand that concept of local seed producers and the challenges they face and what we've learned over the time of them having to really become vine root enterprises to be economically sustainable. But if you look across, for example, these 3 different innovative packages, which are defined by their principal outcome, and you have the improved nutrition, and you have the improved food security and nutrition, and then you have improved incomes. Basically, if you look at local partnerships and what is the easiest thing for partners to do on their own if they're particularly smaller in size, is the improved food and nutrition security modules or packages of innovations. And they don't necessarily take every part of that package, but that's been the easiest one to move beyond, being supported, implementing partners with our facilitation or the facilitation of an organization like Catholic Relief Services, because it's the least complex. And oftentimes people take orange flesh sweet potato or another, and they integrate it into their multi-crop existing food security programs. I'm a big believer for longer term, for acceleration and sustainability, we really have to work on the income side and getting the income model moving. But that really, and then in this case, in the model presented here, it's dealing with developing processed product markets. But that's more technologically complex, needs a lot more backstopping. So the technologies are still being upgraded to get there. And so they aren't at the level of what we call being able to be scaled by people without technical assistance. So you can see in this scaling readiness model, the barrel, I think, is a very appropriate thing. If you have one part of the barrel that hasn't reached that place where the technology is worked out, that's where you're having the need to do more research, sort of adapted research with partners to solve that bottleneck within the system. So I think one of the things that we really emphasized and developed as part of this Sweet Potato for Profit Analysis initiative was really focusing on, if you want a broad range of local partners in particular, or NGO partners of any size, to be able to take up this knowledge and utilize it, they have to have access to quality training material. And so we did spend a considerable effort putting together with our other research partners, 13 modules of training materials and a trainer of trainers module, which was learning by doing, getting it into an effective 10-day course, and really making and strengthening a local institution in these countries that are listed here to be able to implement that course and run that course as part of their ongoing curriculum. In 2020, with that course, it was finally also digitized. So there is a digital version as well, only in English, I'm afraid, but that has happened as well. And again, all these materials are available online. And so as you start expanding, as Jean-Michel mentioned, you can lose control, right? Because people can choose what parts of that they want to implement or put into their own programs. We also created an investment guide, which was sort of a step-by-step guide that lays out the decision points that you need to make and what you're going to do within the value chain, depending on whether you're going to commit to trying to change young child nutritional status, and therefore you need to have the community nutrition model, or you want to go into marketing and what that would engage, and also helping them give some budget guidance and also contacts for technical assistance in the countries in which we were supporting and backstopping the breeding initiatives, so people could have contact points. Because critical to all of this really was having the right varieties, and we started with an approach as again, over this process, as we were using the best we had while we were breeding for better. But one of the things I really think was enabling us to make a difference was having a vibrant community of practice of breeders. And this was possible because we got buy-in from AGRA to support national breeding programs. So you know, in this period, we moved from just having 2 countries really breed to having 13. A lot of breeders trained up to the PhD level, so you're getting that critical mass of breeding expertise, and you're getting people engaged and have the ownership of the varieties that they themselves have released, which I think was quite important. So in this decade, we had, you know, 162 varieties released in 16 countries, and they committed to the idea that a significant percentage of these would be orange fleshed. 104 that were released were orange fleshed. And getting these varieties that were more adapted to local conditions and the culinary preferences of those local populations, I think, is really critical to getting your long-term adoption. And so really the constraint that we always see and continues to be is, in spite of the commitment on paper, you know, governments still underinvest in agriculture research. And when you're dealing with a crop like sweet potato, even though the awareness has been raised, it's usually not on the same priority level as your maize and your rice and other of those kinds of staple crops. And I think that limited government support for breeding and these other core activities that really are functions of the public sector is a great concern as we try and move forward. Because again, as our head breeder in Peru always says, you know, breeding is a continual pipeline, and especially in the context of climate change, that's very true. So looking at some of the issues, you know, to try and get the sustained long-term commitment, you know, I think vegetatively propagated crops, your sweet potatoes, your cassavas, will always have a significant public sector component, especially in the early generation seed arena. And we've worked quite a bit with national programs to get them trying to take a business type perspective on how they generate that seed and set up rotation funds to be able to maintain producing that seed. And of course, these whole decentralized networks of seed multipliers. And we've learned that prioritizing biofortified and other nutrient enhanced crops in policy documents doesn't automatically lead to government resources being invested in the activities. And that's another follow-up one has to do, as when we really focused on identifying, getting advocates within the national systems. And that was very successful in getting, working with Harvest Plus and others, getting these biofortified crops as policy highlights within government documents. But the slog is really getting into the programming, particularly as many countries are going for more decentralized models of governance, which means you almost have to deal at the decentralized level of the district, which is really a time bottleneck in terms of being able to do that collaboration at the local level with governments. The chronic problem of insufficient funding of agriculture research, I've already mentioned. And of course, you know, we've known that one of the real solutions in terms of the CGIAR would be to have longer duration funding with CGIAR NICE collaboration at the core as part of the solution. But getting that longer term funding always seems to be a critical constraint to moving that kind of idea forward, even though I think everybody in principle agrees that that is something that is critically needed. And scaling is accelerated when we have countries that have invested in public sector extension. We've seen that happen. And so we need to, we recognize in many countries that isn't the norm. So we need to be innovative in our knowledge transfer models. And increasingly, I'm looking at the education sector, especially for integrating basic nutritional knowledge as a life skill. And the local partnerships, it's been really interesting what Jean-Michel was saying, but one of the things we faced in working with the smaller partners is we often had to spend considerable time strengthening their management systems so they could meet our donor requirements for reporting. And I think this is something that if we're going to invest in localization, we have to pay real attention to. Because otherwise the system could backfire on us because people are accountable, donors are accountable to their sources of funding, their congresses, et cetera. And then finally, getting access to urban markets is critical for sustained and accelerated adoption. even if the consumers targeted do not have the greatest nutritional need. So that's something you have to convince people if they're looking at this as mostly a nutrition intervention. Our support tends to be for rural areas, which is really critical, but we do have to break in to these urban markets to get these market movings. And we have found institutional markets, school feeding, et cetera, can be very good and effective entry points. So I'll stop there, Julian. Sorry, I went a little over time.
Great, thank you very much to both of you. I think those are extraordinary presentations, but as you say, very, very different. So we've got a few minutes now for question and answer. We've got a few questions in the chat box. I want to start with one from Desi Martinez Barron, which I think is quite interesting. Says, however, the examples given are very technology oriented. What do you have to say about the role of institutional or social innovations? And I want to put that to both of you because I know, you talked about technology, but also your whole experience was enveloped with institutional and social innovation. So maybe both of you can talk a little bit about that. Let me just give you the other questions and then I'll turn to both of you to talk about this. So I think Judy Payne has asked about localized digital solutions, which Jean-Michel has answered in the chat, but she also asked, are there examples beyond Senegal of somewhat similar successes, Jean-Michel and Jan, perhaps in countries with weaker farmer groups? Okay, so institutional issues and then beyond Senegal with weaker farmer groups. And then I see Leonard has put in a question for Jan about given the Russia-Ukraine crisis and the impact on wheat, what about the potential of blending orange flesh sweet potato flour with wheat? I know you'll have something to say on that. Let's see. Yes. Okay. So let me turn to you. And then if there's time, I have a question for both of you, but let's turn to the audience questions first. Jan, do you want to start off, please?
Yeah, in terms of digital solutions, it's very interesting and it's very country specific. For example, when we were working in Rwanda, the use of WhatsApp, because many farmer organizations had those, or specific farmers within organizations had that access, took off. And again, that was a technology that was already being used and existing, but it could really link seed producers to farmers and farmers to markets. And that exchange, and if it was just coordinated and to get it started, then it keeps on going on its own. So I thought that was a very interesting use of that kind of technology. And of course, digital tools has a lot to do with which countries really have significant connectivity to get those kinds of things working. If you want to use them in terms of having a system where people are, having to get reporting done as opposed to keeping records for themselves. I think Jean-Michel had a totally different model, which I think is very interesting. But again, as obviously being from a research institution, we are often asked to provide high quality evidence, and that's a conundrum for us because there's certainly trade-offs there. On the Russian-Ukraine question, it's of course, we actually work on and promote the use of orange flesh sweet potato puree, which is steamed and mashed puree, because it's much cheaper than the flour and is economically competitive with wheat flour. And we're seeing lots of interest right now in wheat flour substitution. And actually in many countries, people, we're getting messages coming in for that potential because 30 to 60% of the wheat flour can be replaced by the puree in various products. So again, this makes sense, markets for local farmers, and the vast majority of sub-Saharan African countries import a significant percentage, if not all, of their wheat flour. And again, most of that is often for these growing urban markets. Let me hand over to Jean-Michel because of time to address some of his questions.
Yeah, maybe one last thing from you, Jan. The times that I visited you in the field, I always think about the effort to socialize the importance of orange flesh sweet potato and vitamin A. Yeah, so very much beyond just the varieties and yield and income aspect is the task of socializing, a
Yes.
relatively new idea, and people are used to eating white sweet potatoes. So
Yeah.
orange, and I mean, really, I think your group and SIP has pioneered the idea of how do you do that kind of social marketing, which I think was a tremendous.
Yes, yeah, the whole idea is, that's right. That leads to it. I'm trying to look at your principal number here, number 6. Demand creation is at the core of everything. And I think, we've worked with a lot of creative people in different countries that have good local ideas, but the whole concept of exploiting the color orange for creating awareness about, in general, healthier foods that have vitamin A as a significant component. So the orange and green strategy, marketing stalls that are painted, radio programs, promotional materials, and just building up, I think, getting that awareness out of nutrition. And, one of the things, again, in the beginning, it really, took time to get it to take off, but once it started moving, it started moving. And then we had the benefit really in this past decade of the scaling up nutrition movement happening. And sometimes you just get lucky with the enabling environment changing, and what we were doing fit right in and corresponded to what that enabling environment of the scaling up nutrition movement was promoting. So I think really demand creation is something I strongly believe in. I often get into arguments with people on the whole, oh yes, you must, do market-driven demand. But market driven is often for, they know how to drive markets, but that's often to eat your less nutritious foods and your fat filled foods and your sugary foods. That's what nobody wakes up saying, I feel vitamin A deficient today. So again, I think, there's some philosophical differences in how you approach this. And it takes time to develop the demand for healthier foods. But I think we've learned how to do these demand creation campaigns.
Great, thanks so much. So Jean-Michel, over to you. There were several questions directed to you. What were the social institutional innovations around your work? Yeah, rather than just the focus on varieties. I think you talked a little bit about that. Judy had asked about examples beyond Senegal. And I'm also, wondering whether there is a late question that came in on, let's see, seeding control. Yeah, and why is that so important? Why is it so hard for donors and funders to seed control? And you highlighted that as very important in your presentation. And I wondered if you have comments on the Ukraine situation, right? And what that might mean as Senegal's reduced ability to import wheat, if that's going to be a boost or, an issue for your rice investments. So over to you, Jean-Michel.
Okay. So quickly concerning the social dimension, one thing that came out of this when you decentralize and you cede control to the dissemination, the multiplication, the management of the whole thing, you end up creating at the local level very strong hubs and very focused hubs. And in the case of rain-fed rice, what it did, because it's a women-led crop, what it had us do is to rethink the extension services and have even more localized extension because women are not that mobile. And so it ended up creating a whole cohort of young women extensionists and developed these capacities. And when we brought in like digital technologies, when I say localized, it's really autonomously managed digital tools that don't necessarily need to connect with the exterior, but this notion of consuming numbers for yourself and eventually sharing them with the outside world is very different. And it made me find that, there's a saying I say now that through that program, I found out that there's actually a geek in every village, and that geek is often a young woman, and you just give them the opportunity to learn the data, and they end up, I've seen young women with a early secondary school education, do pivot tables after 2 years. So what I'm saying is that kind of empowerment creates change. some of these farmer organizations in their region, in their zone, in their communes, become leaders in the definition of their needs and in the driving of investment strategies and priorities. One of them, the one who's very well known, who met President Obama, she's now the head of the maize producers organization in Senegal. That woman was just in a very male-dominated industry, and now she's the top dog in the maize sector because she gets the numbers and she understands the data. And so it's this notion of not outsourcing to some outside platform. It's really this notion of developing an organic understanding of what data is, which actually, Jan, addresses your data quality issues, because you've got people who are sifting through their databases every day. They really, really know what's in it. And it's not a survey. This is their lifeblood. You know, one person, one of those farmer leaders said in a webinar, she said, these databases are our lungs, you know, and she was saying, we are not sharing that data casually. We will not just sending around. This has value. And so this shift it has driven many social change, many inclusive development. And again, I've seen lots of young women seizing the opportunity of digital and data control and precision agriculture that comes from that locally driven research and creates actual business opportunities. I could go on and on that. Other programs, one thing I've seen, and you know, the thing I'm talking about here is working with these very local organizations and building them up. But it's also true that with Feed the Future, an alternate program approach is what you call the agent model. I mean, having local agents connected to, you know, higher level providers and within their communities, at one point developing that kind of outreach. Recently, you know, I had doubts, you know, as to the sustainability of all this, but recently there's been an impact study from USAID in Uganda on one of those early agent models that was actually implemented by Chemonics, but they're not there. They have been, you know, Chemonics has left for the past 3 years. And the ex-post assessment shows that these agents are still present. They're still vectors of technology and ways of scaling. And you should know, Jan, that, you know, some of those farmer groups that I'm talking about in Senegal have actually participated in programs led by CLUSA to expand sweet potato consumption. And so, when you go and they invite you, well, sometimes in the chiboudienne and the rice, you'll end up having sweet potato in there and orange flesh. So just so you know,
Yeah.
so this is like
the rice sweet potato combo is very. We've got great evidence for that in Uganda. It benefits both crops.
I can
that
tell
kind
you
of rotation.
Great.
Well,
Thanks to both of you. You know, unfortunately, we're out of time almost. I want to give the last couple of minutes to Leonard Waltering, the chair of the ARD. And I want to take this opportunity to thank both of you, Jan and Jean-Michel. I think you've given us a lot of, no pun intended, food for thought on the whole localization issue and why it's so important to invest in local organizations and cede control to them, as Jean-Michel said. So I think really a lot of great experiences and lessons shared with us today. Really appreciate it. Leonard, over to you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you to the three J's, Jan, Julie, and Jean-Michel. Thank you so much. I just want to keep it very short. I just posted the recordings of last month's session. This is already our third session today. Now we had the first session on land degradation in January, then in February with Kate and Christian Collins from One Acre Fund, also very interesting. And now we'll add this recording to that as well. So I invite you to come to the website. The next session is going to be on the 28th of April, again, the last Thursday of the month. And that will be led by Frank Place. And yeah, thank you so much. We're exactly on the hour. And thank you very much and for your participation and your great questions, and hope to see you next month.
Thank you. Thanks, Julie.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much.